Um, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Kasia Grabska to PRIO. We've known each other for quite a while through the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration, where we're both members. And she's worked on Sudan and on Sudanese refugees in Kakuma and Egypt, yes, exactly, for as long as I remember. And it's a great honor to have her here, and as well as Maria Gabrielse, our own Maria Gabrielse, who works at PRIO as a senior researcher. And I won't take long. I just want to say that this is this is the first seminar actually of Mobilities and Conflict network, which was funded by the Research Council through Samco. And basically we have a group of people coming together both in Norway and further abroad to look at how mobilities and conflict are shaped by cultural prerequisites and also the other way around. And this is something that was set up by CMI, which is represented by Arne Strand, and NTNU by Katrine Brun, who is running at this moment towards this location. Both took a very early flight from Bergen and Trondheim, and by PRIO myself. And we've gotten funding to set up these seminars where we get the chance to invite people to come to Norway. And there's quite a few interesting events coming up for that. But also to write a special issue, and we have a panel at the European Association of Social Anthropologists in Paris later. So the question will be looked at in 4 different spaces. So we found that this is a relevant issue to look at mobilities and conflict, how they interact, and how they create cultural and social change in refugee camps, in cities, in sites of return, and in transnational spaces. So the seminars will each focus on either one or a combination, and in this case on sites of return, if I can summarize it like that. So that's all I wanted to say, except welcome to all of you. We have a very diverse group, so it's interesting also to hear a discussion. We have set aside about an hour for discussion, so do write down your questions and comments.
Thank you very, very much for inviting me and for making me part of this very interesting group of people that you're creating. We've been working on this initiative now for a while, and I think it's really wonderful that something like a displacement initiative and a sort of network of different types of mobilities in the context of conflict is becoming a strong theme within PRIO. So fantastic work. And it's my pleasure to meet all of you and to meet Maria, to learn more about work that is going on now in Sudan and in South Sudan. I hear there's quite a few people who are working on these different issues now. So let me not delay, and I'll try to talk for about 30-35 minutes. I have a tendency to go on, so if you feel really bored, just let me know that it's boring, exactly, and stop me. And then Maria has a few comments, and then we can have a discussion. So this is the title of my presentation, South Sudanese Women's Roles, if you wish, in Peacebuilding. Peace brokers, violated wives, luggage women, daughters of the...
Yeah. I think you actually have to stand up because
otherwise
it's
I
difficult
can't.
to hear.
Okay.
People, actually.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah, is it better if I...
I don't know if your mic is on.
I don't know. No.
Well, that might help. Thanks.
Maybe now?
Yeah.
Okay. Fine. So let's go back to the title. South Sudanese Women's Roles in Peacebuilding. Peace brokers, violated wives, luggage women, daughters of the AK-47. AK-47 is a type of a gun, you probably know that. And the new development agents. So I have all these different fantastic titles that are given for women. Now, I just wanted to start with some of these images, and I call them binary images that we hear in media, and some of them are also propagated by literature, by academic literature, of women seen either as victims of violence and kind of the ones that suffered the most during the wars, or as the great heroes of peace and the peacemakers. So I just put on the slide some of these terms that are used in international media. So for example, women and children are the primary victims of violence in the new tribal clashes in South Sudan. So that's just an example from South Sudan. Amnesty International's last year campaign, the 16 days of activism against gender violence, from peace in the home to peace in the world. So linking the two spheres, the private sphere of home and household and the public sphere of the community and the nation or the state. Let's challenge militarism and end violence against women. So there's this stress on violence against women, and rape with impunity in Congo. And in Congo, it's an example that is quoted extensively in the media. Epidemic of rape in DRC. So it's the type of words that we also use to show this, to emphasize women's suffering and women's victimhood. And then, from November, in the Libyan case, for example, Libyan women demand support for war rape victims. So it's all relates to this kind of gendered violence committed during war times. But as you remember, also in Afghanistan, for example, the international intervention of the armed forces, the international armed forces, was motivated by, at that time, President Bush, who said, we have to go and liberate the Afghan women. So we have, this other aspect of, we, the international community, who will liberate these poor women who are suffering. And, the type of images that we see a lot in the media. This is from the war in Bosnia. Women as victims, or you see in the refugee camps a lot of women with children, for example, and the refugee camps are very often portrayed as women and children that dominate the camps. If we think about women and children dominating the general demographic population of the world, we can say it as a general comment, women and children constitute 70% of the demographic of the world. So for example, Cynthia Enlow called this factor women and children, and she writes it together as one word, saying that, and women in that way are kind of made into children themselves and seen as this powerless victims. But on the other hand, the other image of women that we have in the media, and is being propagated more and more, especially last year when we had the Nobel Prize winners, 3 women, is women as champions of peace. So women are seen as the more peaceful by nature, supposedly. So this is a gathering of peacemakers, if you wish, women champions of peace at the Kennedy School of Governance in the US. And one of the women, so for example, this is a lady that works in Afghanistan, this lady in Pakistan, but this one is actually from the South Sudan Women's Empowerment Network, who was very active during the North-South conflict in championing the cause of peace. So this is the other set of binary images, if you wish. So we have this construction of women as peacemakers in the public discourses. And even sort of the latest constructions by international leaders. President Obama, for example, recently signed an executive order on women, peace, and security, and sort of insisting that women have to be more involved in the peace-building processes. So what I want to do in this presentation, I want to address some of the more, this problematic view of such simplistic views as either or. Women are either victims or peacemakers. And I want to look at the consequences of this these binary constructions for the position of women within the social relations, their agency and their identities, but also more broadly for the power relations in the context of peacemaking, peace-building, and nation-building processes. And I want to go beyond the simplistic divisions and assumptions and look at more complex and heterogeneous roles of women. And then I also want to look at the type of peace and the levels of analysis that we use for analyzing peace. Are we analyzing peace at the national level? Or are we looking at peace constructed also within households, for example, or within the community? And how do they relate? How do these different levels of analysis relate? And I want to suggest that war and conflict and displacement open up certain possibilities for changing power relations, specifically gender power relations, and empowering some women and giving them a more powerful position within social relations, but at the same time disempowering others. So it's not a win-win situation for women, war and conflict only, but for men as well. It's much more complex than that. So just very briefly on the background of the conflict. So the context of my presentation is actually, it's a complex context, because in a way it's a war between the conflict between the North and the South Sudan. But what I'm actually going to focus on, I'm going to focus on the inter and intra-community conflicts that were happening in southern Sudan, and more specifically in the western Upper Nile region, in the so-called now unity state, among the Nuer population. And those of you who are anthropologists, Nuer are sort of the celebrated ethnic group of people in the anthropology with Evans Pritchard and Sharon Hutchinson writing about them. So this is a map from before the independence of South Sudan, and it shows the number of displaced people who registered for return after 2005, the peace agreement between the North and the South. So this is just to demonstrate that as a result of the North-South war between 1983 and 2005, people were displaced into a variety of locations. Estimated 500,000 and 700,000 people went outside of the borders of, at that time, Sudan, so to the countries around Sudan. Some of them were also resettled to Canada, Australia, and so on. But a lot of them actually remained in Sudan and were mainly displaced from the south to the north. So a lot of them settled around Khartoum. Some people talk about 4 million, 5 million. I mean, these are really estimates. So my fieldwork this research, the presentation that I'm doing today is based on my doctoral fieldwork that I did among the Nuer refugees in the refugee camp in Kakuma in Kenya, that was here. So I spent some time in the refugee camp there in 2006 and 2007, and then I followed a group of people who decided to return to Western Upper Nile. So this is the new map of Sudan. This is South Sudan, and I covered the second part of my fieldwork in Ler, which is a small town in Western Upper Nile, in the Unity State, which is now really on the border with the North. And this is an area that nowadays is subject to new displacement and bombings and from the North because of the oil reserves that we have here. So this is strategically a very important area. Now, so the kind of complex historical context of this conflict, and I'm not going to be talking about the North-South, but really the and inter-community conflict in the Western Upper Nile region between the Nuer groups and the Dinka groups, but also among the different Nuer groups themselves. That relates to the period of 1991, 1999. This is the sort of huge, very intense ethnic conflict then. And one of the reasons, when you talk to people, and then when you read the literature, of course, is the fact that oil was referred to not as a resource but as a curse for this population. So oil is seen as a very important reason for this conflict. And among the Sudanese Sudan Liberation Army, we have a split in 1991. A group of Nuer under the command of Riek Machar, who comes from the town where I was doing the field work, separated from John Garang and split the SPLA movement in two. And then there were different fractions as well, and was funded by the North to continue the conflict against the Southern rebels. So we have a lot of power struggles in that area. And one of the references that people make when they describe the conflict in that area is, this is the war of the educated. And the concept of educated comes from the fact that John Garang and Riek Machar both had PhDs. And the people who were in the leadership positions, they were the educated, highly educated South Sudanese. So when you talk to the people who stayed in the villages and suffered the consequences of this fighting, they talk about, well, this was not the population of these villages that wanted to fight. This was all instigated by this greater interest of the educated. So the concept of the war of the educated. And then the other different dynamic in that conflict is, because you have, inter and intra-ethnic conflicts in that area forever. I mean, this is not something new. But what is new is the type of technology that is being used in this conflict in that specific period. So it's the time from spears to guns, and the kind of changing nature of violence, where suddenly you have, instead of people fighting with spears over, cattle or sort of feudal disputes, they start fighting with guns. And I'm not going to go into anthropological explanations of how this actually is significantly different, but the meaning of spearing someone directly has a much greater impact on your prospects as a person, as an individual, than just shooting someone with a gun that becomes a very impersonal relation. So therefore, you have an intensification of the violence, because shooting with a gun becomes something that is impersonal. You don't have, for you as a newer man, for example, the consequences of shooting someone with a gun are very different. Okay? And the type of ethnic violence that also emerges in this context, that is linked to the position of women, is an important change. In the past, before the split of SPLA in 1991, in the inter-community and intra-community conflicts, women are seen as the protectors, as the ones that are protectors, but also to be protected. So they have a special status in the community. They are not supposed to be killed. They are not supposed to be targeted. Women and children are spared. And one of the reasons for this is this kind of, as Hutchinson calls it, primordial concept of ethnicity, where a woman belongs to anyone in the community except in bed, which means that a newer woman can become a Dinka woman. She's not seen as an enemy. Or a newer woman from one clan can become a woman of another clan by marriage, for example, or by being stolen. So her ethnicity is not fixed, and therefore the fact that she doesn't have a fixed ethnicity protects her, because she doesn't have to be targeted. She's not seen as an enemy. Whereas men, their ethnicities are seen as much more fixed, and therefore a newer man from a specific clan stays a newer man from that specific clan, or a Dinka man stays a Dinka man. Children have a similar position to women, where their ethnicity is not fixed and their clan belonging is not fixed. So until that point, they can kind of circulate, and they are not seen as enemy. They are seen as also an asset that you can sort of trade and use. And women have also this protective role, where if, for example, fighters from two different communities clash and the enemy ends up in her house, she actually has a power to protect him. Therefore, people from her own clan or from her own ethnic group cannot come and kill the so-called enemy in her house. This all changes with the change in the nature of violence and conflict in the 1991, or in this period, 1991, 1999. And suddenly women the ethnicity becomes much more fixed. So a newer woman from a clan becomes a newer woman from a clan, and she becomes an enemy. And this is linked a lot to the North-South conflict, where a lot of Southern women were being kidnapped and killed and targeted by the Northern armies. So the type of logic that was being used in the North-South conflict starts affecting the Southern conflict, or the South-South conflict. All right? Now, giving you all this big background, I will now go to the presentation itself. So, as I mentioned, I was doing this ethnography of displacement and emplacement, and following people from Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya to Ler, and this is a group of refugees that is being actually transported by a plane, since the distances are big. And they arrive in Ler, in this nice village with, sort of agricultural livelihoods still dominate the area, but there's also some trade. It's an important trade center. And I will, to kind of situate this paper, I'll start with a story of Nyalada, a young woman in her 20s, who was married, had 2 children, and she had several miscarriages. And she talks about her experiences during the war. I'm not going to read this all to you, but I'll just give you a few abstracts. So she talks about the fact that most of us women during the wars were much less mobile. Because of their reproductive roles, they were much more linked to the household and to the place where they were staying. So therefore, they had much less access to refuge, if you wish. And less of them went to refugee camps, much less if you look at the Ethiopian camps or the Kenyan camps. And if you look at the women from Western Upper Nile, there are actually very small percentages. In Kakuma, 75% of the population from South Sudan were actually men. So it's an interesting dynamic, because this is not something what you normally find in the literature on the camps. And the women from that region, you find a lot of them in Khartoum, because it was also easier to access Khartoum. But a lot of people in the village that stayed behind were actually women and sort of women and children, or elderly people. And those who reached the refugee camps were those who had some powerful connections in the community, so whose husbands or sons worked for international organizations or churches, or for the rebel movement. So the other thing that she talks about this period of the Bull Nuer, that's one of the clans, or one of the groups of the Western Upper Nile Nuer. And she talks about the fighting in 1997, when you had a lot of these attacks, of intra-community attacks, and a lot of women were being, from one Nuer group, were being taken as wives by the other group. They were also being killed and so on. And they were made to, they had to support the effort on both sides. So they had to have enough food for the soldiers that were coming from their own group, but they also had to have enough food to support the soldiers that were coming from another rebel group. So they were sort of balancing their very uncomfortable position as women that were sort of targeted by all these different lines. And she talks about her story, how she became a wife of one of the rebel commanders from the other newer group, and how she had to give birth and carry ammunition and carry luggage. So this is where I use this concept of violated wives and luggage women, and support the enemy side, if you wish. But then she was also maneuvering this, and she was trying to find her way out of this situation. So she was not this passive victim just waiting for something to happen. She was also saving food for herself and trying to somehow stay alive. And when the opportunity came, she escaped. And when she joined her hometown, where she had the rebels from her group, she actually went to the barracks and she said, well, now I want to become a soldier because I want to win this war my way. So she learned how to shoot. She got a gun, and how she says, this time I was helping my people in winning the war. So this was the other, suddenly her position changes. So by this story, what I want to demonstrate is that her position was changing during the war, from a victim, survivor, to a perpetrator of violence, from carrying luggage for the enemy to carrying weapons and guns for her people. And her efforts to aim peace and war were very ambiguous and changing all the time, fluid. Now, her mother, at the same time, managed to join the refugee camp in Kenya because of her, one of her brothers was working with, I think, UNICEF, and therefore she was able to join this. So in this stage of war, what I want to emphasize is the fact that, first of all, the violence was being carried out on the bodies of women. So women were the violated ones and so on. But femininities and the agency of women was being also reconfigured during this time. So women were sort of constantly changing their positions. And for example, in 1986, SPLA recognized the role of women in combat, and created a battalion, women battalion, that didn't last very long because soon they realized that actually they were losing women and therefore reproductive force. So the women, I think the battalion carried out only 1 or 2 battles. But to say that, you know, women were actually conscripted into the rebel forces and took part, active part, as soldiers. In 2007, when the demilitarization and demobilization of soldiers was happening in South Sudan, there were about 3,500 women registered as former conscripts. The other thing, women were also, so, you know, women were playing these very conflicting roles. Also, guns were playing an important role in women's lives, not only in the kind of communal public sphere, but also at home. Women started using guns to protect themselves, protect their children, and the importance of guns is, for example, represented by the use of the name Nyaklan, which was the daughter of an AK-47, of a gun, which is something that, you know, has a symbolic importance. And the other point of winning the reproductive front. So while men were sort of charged with this role of winning the war front, women were expected to continue giving birth to the children. So you had winning taboos were, for example, completely broken, where normally there was kind of expected time, well, between first child and second child, the child was about 2-year difference. During the war, this was completely abandoned. Women just had to continue giving birth to produce the soldiers for liberation of South Sudan, but also so the South Sudanese or ethnic groups wouldn't disappear. And women were kind of tossed around between different commanders. And if their husbands were not around, if they were in the bush, women were kind of tossed around between different men. Some of them men from the same family, but some of them were other related men to produce the children for the war. But we should also stress that women were also active, became kind of active in distributing food during the war. And that was recognized by international organizations, but also the Sudanese, the SPLA local authorities. They also became active in resisting war and trying to bring solutions to the conflict. So we had groups of women that, for example, organized a conference to solve the inter-ethnic conflict in Western Upper Nile. In 1999, we had a conference in Wonlit, and that's from the initiative of a group of women. And then the New Sudan Council of Churches that joins in and organizes this conference. So now the second phase is the kind of gender displacement, and I'm focusing specifically on Kakuma camp, and I'll go through it very quickly. So the type of roles, if you wish, women played in peacebuilding in Kakuma camp. Kakuma camp is a place that is has a heavy presence of humanitarian organizations. So I called it this kind of international humanitarianism and gendered modernity, if you wish, introduced in the camp. And I focus specifically on the gender mainstreaming programs that exist in the camp. So when you enter the camp, you straight away see all these different beautiful signs of, women rights are human rights, and real men educate their women. And so there is a huge emphasis on this. And the other thing that you see in the camp straight away are workshops. Hundreds of workshops that are happening for the population to be trained on women's rights, on human rights, on peaceful coexistence, for example. So we have this creation of women as peaceful and as peacemakers, but also the construction of new women, the women who are empowered, who know their rights, and who are going to create this women equal or gender just society, gender equality. The problem with these programs is that when you actually look at it, how women are constructed by international organizations, they are still constructed as victims of violence. As you have a lot of discourses going on in the camp saying, men are the perpetrators of violence and women are the victims of violence. Sometimes it's the use of survivor that is supposed to give you a greater agency as a woman, but the underlying message is still the same. So that's one aspect of it. And then, on the other hand, championing this cause of women as the agents of development and these peacemakers. And completely overlooking the power dynamics and the different positionality of women and men within the different communities. The fact that, yes, some women might have sort of more pro-peace views, but that doesn't mean that men don't have these views. A lot of men are against the conflict, right? That also overlooks the fact that some of these gender empowerment programs actually create conflict within the household. So we have another type of conflict that is being created at the lower levels, where you have gendered wars, as I call them, within the household themselves, right? So we have all these different dynamics going on, and I think one thing that I should also mention is how women themselves in the camps were sort of maintaining this resistance and peace building efforts. And they use different strategies. And this is actually quite interesting because as in war, they were using their bodies to survive, being, the kind of engaging in marriages, so-called protective marriages with powerful commanders. In the camp, at some point in Kakuma and in Nairobi, women did a strike, and they said, we're not going to be having sex with and giving birth to children unless you stop fighting. So it's also the use of reproductive powers and position of women. So it's strategic uses, if you wish. But then we also have important women's organizations that appear in diaspora, in Nairobi, across East Africa, but also in the US. For example, the woman that I mentioned at the very beginning from the South Sudan Women's Empowerment Network. That's a group that was very active since 2002 in peace negotiations. Now, so we have the returnees to Le, and this is actually all women. These are the ones from Khartoum, in fact, but you see they're all carrying something. So just to, last slide before I conclude, gendered peace. So as you can see, we have this women's resistance with different types of contributions to peace building processes. But this is all happening in the context of the emerging South Sudanese state. And South Sudanese state that the interim constitution and also the Common Peace Agreement that were signed in 2005 emphasize a lot gender equality. So they are also based on these principles of gender equality suddenly. So in a way, you see that there is this state engagement and the official kind of public discourse of gender equality, women's roles, positive roles in the peace building and nation building processes. However, when it comes to actual peace negotiations, you have a lot of women that are being excluded from the peace negotiations. That happens, not only in South Sudan, anywhere. I mean, that's kind of a trend that you have women quite active in the resistance movement during the conflict. But when it comes to the peace agreement and the new independent state right now, the situation is very different. So there are actually few women, although there is a guarantee of 25% of women in public office, if you wish, the 25% limit hasn't been reached, and there are far few women in the public office, if you wish. But also in this period, the whole women's reproductive and productive roles are being downplayed. So the discourse that you have, for example, in SPLM campaigns in 2007, 2008, they talk about men, the heroes who won the war, and suddenly the fact that women were giving birth to all these children, it's overlooked. So women, yes, they were supporting the effort, they were giving the food, but there is much less emphasis on the fact that women took a huge burden and a huge responsibility during the war. And in this post-war and post-independence now period, women in a way are sort of expected to go back to the households that were fragmented during the wars and assume their roles as women, as the ones who are in the most subordinate positions. And the kind of keepers of tradition and culture. So the whole issue of transmitting, you know, being unaware and the right aware and how we behave, it's very much based on women. So again, this is something that you see in all different contexts. And lastly, so the emergence of the state and then also the very active role of international actors, donors, NGOs, UN agencies, that put focus on gender mainstreaming and women as championing women as the kind of new development agents. So there's a lot of funding to women's organizations. And if you go to Juba, I'm sure, I haven't been to Juba in a long time, but from what I hear, there are a lot of different, you know, women, microcredit programs, and women-run programs, and so on and so forth. When you go to the smaller villages, the interesting thing is that some of these organizations are actually run by men. They have a woman in the title. They are run by men, and when you ask about, so, you know, how do you understand women's rights? They say, oh, you know, women and men are equal. They have the same rights, so women can also cut the testicle of the bull. Okay, fine, they can cut the testicle, but can they do other things like, you know, do they have equal access to education? Do they have equal access to decision making? No, these are different things, you know. So it's also interesting to see how people interpret these debates. So what is happening in Juba and in the national state, in the capital of the state, is slightly different to what is happening in other places. So just to conclude, this is the picture from the South Sudan Women Empowerment Network, and you see, again, this is in Juba, but you know, so they kind of have a network of the organizations in different places throughout South Sudan, but it's championing the kind of cause of girls and women and looking at the active participation of women in the peace-building processes. But also, this is an organization that has sort of a feminist agenda. So they actually talk very much about gender justice, gender equality in a sense of gender justice. And the chairwoman of this organization, she was, as I was mentioning before, she was kind of very discouraged by the processes that are going on right now. The fact that women, yes, they are maybe put in visible positions, but in fact, the logic of inequality, in this case, gender inequality, is still there. So just to conclude, what I wanted to do in this presentation is to show you that we have to go beyond this binary constructions of women and look at the diverse roles that women have that occupy in different phases of conflict and displacement and in peace building itself, but also look at these positions as fluid and as changing all the time. So this is not, you know, it's not that a peacemaker will always be a peacemaker. There are different positions, and we have to see how women and men use these positions at times strategically, and how they manipulate them as well. I think we should also think about, when we talk about peace building, we should also think about what type of peace are we talking about, and which levels of analysis are we looking at? Is it the national level of peace, or are we also looking at all these other levels that actually influence what is happening at the national level, the household level, the community level? And as I mentioned, the type of changes that happened during the war and displacement and some of the more empowered positions that women gained created a lot of tensions and gender wars at the household level. So how these different levels of peace are connected, and how do we think about it? And also, I think we should think about the fact that different groups, and when I talk about different groups, it's not only women and men, but also women who were displaced to Khartoum, or women who stayed behind, or women who were in the Kakuma camps and were kind of trained in this gender mainstreaming programs. They might have different imaginations about the type of peace that they want to have in their household, in their community, in their nation. The type of terms of reference of the peace process, if you wish. So there are tensions, and you see it, there are tensions among this and between these groups. And lastly, what type of peace and on whose terms? And here, what I want to pay attention to is the fact that some of the strategic voices of women that they were employing in the resistance movement for, calling for gender equality, gender justice, as part of the greater national peace process. They don't necessarily match up with the views of type of peace that other leaders and influential politicians want to have in Sudan right now. So very often, the most strategic goals of women, I don't want to homogenize because they are different, of some women, let's say, of creating a more gender just society, there might be sacrificed for the need for peace for other reasons, for the kind of ethnic dimensions of the peace and so on. So I leave you with this, and I look forward to Maria's comments.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, women education. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Kasia, for this very interesting presentation and with a good background also on the conflict itself, the displacement, and how both the war itself, the placement in the camps, how this, and then the post-conflict reconstruction and peace building, how these different spheres have influenced women's roles, and how the different gender roles are understood and interpreted. And I thought it was interesting to see this as three different sequences that you describe. And it's interesting to see the interlinkages between how is the war itself affecting the redefinition of their roles, how is the displacement redefining, and how is then the post-conflict and peacemaking process affecting their roles. And there may be some changes in the first phase, and then some other changes in the next, and new challenges in the last one, as you point to in your conclusion. And I can come back to some of these challenges. I also thought it was that you reveal some very interesting push factors, if we can call them that, for influencing the women's roles. It is on the first level, the sort of traditional society at home, if you want, that has certain predefinitions of women's roles. Then there is the war itself, is another factor pushing for change in these roles. Then you have economic necessity, also due to the war, of course, but that has its own dynamic of influencing women's roles. And then in the displacement process and in the camps, as you described very well, you have the international organizations and NGOs who have their own dynamic of influencing women's roles. And we could also say that the factor of the absence of men that you refer to at some point is, or the absence of men also due to the war, is also a factor that influences women's roles because they have to take over more responsibilities, for example. And in between these different push factors, some of these factors, or they have different effects on the roles of women and how they are redefined. And you described very well how some of them are maintaining women in more womanly or female roles they may be changing, but they're still perceived as they are women, and they may have certain rights, but it's because they are women, it's because they are victims from the war. And others among these factors are more pushing them to emancipate and take choice and make choices more freely, act for themselves, speak up. And as some of your interviewees describe it, they describe that as acting like men. They take the goal is, or the aim of equality is to not only have specific rights for women, but to be like men. And this is interesting to see how the different external factors influence the redefinition of women's roles in different ways. And in between these different push factors, we have women who themselves renegotiate their roles in the different phases of the war. I think that your story of Nialada in the beginning on the fluidity of her different roles during the war is very interesting and illustrative, and it shows as well. It's a good example to show that she's not only a victim or a peacemaker afterwards, but she occupies a range of different roles during the war. But I was wondering to what extent we could conceptualize these roles as not only her being, or her trajectory, or her roles being fluid from one category to another, but maybe the categories themselves are also changing because the women come in this category and occupy the role of a warrior, for example. And that is one thing. And the other thing is that, or I think you say it well in your presentation already, that it's not fixed, but because we can see that they don't necessarily have just one role and then another, and afterwards another one, but they can have different roles at the same time. And I think this is important to underline as well, because when she takes the proactive choice of taking up arms and fight for her people, it's maybe still a choice that she takes because she has been a victim of the war. So she can, without victimizing her, she's maybe still a victim, or everyone is victims or are victims of the war, but that pushes them to also want to take up weapons, for example. Then I had a comment or a thought around how women's roles and organization during the war had affected civil society in South Sudan, because it has often been pointed out that civil society in South Sudan was almost inexistent during the war because of the SPLM taking all the space, or to put it differently, there was very little space for other organizations than those linked to the SPLM or the churches to have any space of organization. And I was wondering if there was a sort of an exception for women, because maybe they were not seen as potential competitors to the political and armed rule of the SPLM, but they were maybe seen as just something different and not posing any threat to the dominance of the SPLM, and that maybe created some space for them also to organize in South Sudan and outside as well. I also thought it was very interesting to see how women take up new roles in the post-war setting, and the economic aspect is very interesting here. And you say that in your paper that taking up jobs and having an income for themselves allows women to renegotiate or have a different bargaining power in the conjugal relations, but also more broadly in the South Sudanese society. And I was thinking of this sort of parallel in post-war setting with post-war Europe, where the roles that women took up and during the war, and the fact that they worked during the war also became an important factor pushing them to, or in their following emancipation after the war, that they refused to just go back to more traditional roles afterwards, although it, of course, took some time as well. And I was wondering if we could imagine as this scenario in a possible post-war South Sudan, that women who have gotten new roles, new responsibilities, education during the war and in the first post-war years, sort of when returning to South Sudan, refuse to just go back to more traditional roles, but claim new responsibilities and to have their word and their voices being heard. But there is also a new challenge that you point out to in your conclusion and in your paper as well, is that there is a tendency in this post-conflict setting, and that's something that we see clearly in South Sudan today, to respond to this claim for gender balance by simply adding more women in already large male administration, to just add more women to them. And it's not saying that you have equal chances, you just say, well, we have 3 women here, so everything's okay. They are often given the more typical female responsibilities. They're responsible for welfare, women's rights, and children. So, and I think this is a sort of a new type of challenge, because there is, of course, it's of course a good thing that they, when they are given certain responsibilities, but I think it's important to go beyond that and see how they can be part of also the political negotiations of the peace process. Lastly, I have a comment where I draw on an article by Charlie Carpenter that you may have heard of, entitled "Women, Children and Other Vulnerable Groups: Gender, Strategic Frames and the Protection of Civilians as a Transnational Issue." And very briefly, her argument goes along the lines of saying that the international network of protection of civilians, seeking to set this issue of protection of civilians on the agendas of NGOs and international organizations, etc., have assimilated civilians as women, or women and children and the vulnerable, in order to underline the vulnerability of civilians. But that she underlines that there's a danger here of overlooking also, of course, the threats or the vulnerabilities of young men who can be forcibly enrolled in the army and summarily executions, etc. This is not necessarily the focus here, but I was wondering to what extent you have had any experience with this during your field work in the Kakuma camp, that these NGOs and international organizations seems to focus so much on the gender issues in order to have access to the field and have access to funding, because this is sort of the right place to put the focus in a way. And I was also wondering if we could draw a parallel here, because what she says is that by assimilating civilians to only women and children and the elderly, it undermines the very protection of civilians agenda, because they fail to actually protect all those who should be protected, because they fail to focus on the distinction between civilians and combatants, which is the real legal fundament for protection of civilians. And I was wondering here if through the focus on gender and women's rights that the NGOs advance, it seems like there's sometimes run the risk of undermining women's rights at the same time, because they only focus on their roles as victims in the war, and that is why they have certain rights that should be focused on. But maybe this somehow maintains them in this specific role and pacifies them in this role. And a comment to one of the pictures you showed here. I thought it was interesting the sign saying "Real men educate their women," because it's formulated probably by an international NGO, but still it's that's a church. Okay, because I thought it was interesting how it still goes along the lines of real men. There's the conception of what real men are, but it's their role to educate their women. It's still the women belong to the men, but they should educate them. So it's still along the lines of certain traditional conceptualizations. So those were my comments and questions.